Hello students, I welcome you all to my Swayam course titled Comics and Graphic Novels in Indian Context. Now we have moved to week 2 of our course, which will be devoted to the study of Indian comics. In the previous week, that was week 1, we studied the methodology of studying visual narratives, where we studied various critiques and the ways in which how visual texts are read and are in several ways different from the written text. But now in the second week, we have moved to the main text itself. And to begin with, I will study Indian comics. So in today's lecture, which is lecture 1, for studying the Indian comics, we will be studying the Western influence, how Indian comics had its origin in the Western influence of Western comics, how Indian comics were very much borrowed the idea, not only the idea, but also the visuals, the packaging and everything, in Indian comics was in the beginning a copy or just a mimic of the Western comics. And this we will study as a result of the Batman and Spiderman comics, which were part of DC Comics. And secondly, through Phantom, Mandrake, Flash Gordon characters of Indrajal comics. Now, beginning my lecture, I would like to introduce you how the Western influences came to Indian comics. The genesis of the comic book genre in India has its influence from the West. In the beginning, the understanding of the form had a completely different meaning than what it is interpreted today. It was merely seen as page-wise printed book illustration filled with caricatures, cartoons and other sorts of illustrations for telling stories to children. However, with the latter years of gaining acceptability in India, it was rightly understood that no comics is innocent, but it contains politics, complexity and maturity from readers' intelligence to deconstruct the narrative in totality. So when the Western comics was borrowed in the Indian context, the usual idea, the usual tendency that we think that comics are something which are only meant for children's studies, which are something that only an immature person or person where intelligence is not required. So comics as a form is only fit for them. But when comics were studied as a form of formation of culture, when they were seen that they are doing much more than kind of educating small children, they were trying to negotiate, they were trying to seep in through the cultural formations in which India, the shaping of the country was being formed. It was thought that comics are much more than children's literature and they are kind of propagating an ideology, they are kind of propagating a certain mindset which is becoming very necessary, which is becoming very important and playing a crucial role in the shaping of the nation as well as its people. So comics was doing something much more than what it was thought to be. So in the visuals that you see on your screens, first is the cover page of the Batman comics when it was released in India. So the earlier genres of or the earlier comics that were introduced, that were Batman comics and Superman comics, when you see that they were introduced in India, so there are same visuals, it's just that they are available in the translation. Also, not much has changed, but then some of the stories in Batman as well as in Superman also deal with the Indian context, also deal with the Indian scenario, but the scenario in which they dealt with the Indian scene was kind of orientalizing the colonized state, was in a way very much destructive, was in a way which was not in any way uplifting the Indian citizens as well as the country. So it was kind of playing the exotic gaze, it was kind of exoticizing, it was orientalizing in nature when the Batman and Superman comics were introduced in India in the very first years. The Indian comics market beginnings. It was the import of Western comics with some of the most popular titles such as Batman and Superman that occupied the comic book sections in the Indian market. Introduced to the global audience in 1938 and 1939, Superman and Batman Respectively, the main idea behind these superheroes was to register the victory of good over evil. So as you see, the years in which 1938 and 1939, when the Superman and Batman comics were introduced to the global audience, even to the Western audience, was the time when World War II was going on, or it was just being initiated in those years. So in those years, we actually needed a hero who could kind of superheroes who could kind of fight the evils, who could kind of register victory over the wars that were going on, who were try to present themselves as the savior of the masses. So as a result of it, these comics became an instant hit, an immediate success in the global market, because when people saw superheroes like Batman and Superman, and they were trying to save the city, they were trying to save the people, they were trying to reduce the evil, they were trying to fight the monsters, thrash them. Not only the children, but people, adults also felt a certain kind of relief, a certain kind of acceptance was there in the adult mindset also, that they can, it was a kind of positive approach introduced by the comics during the World War II, that people kind of were able to satisfy themselves or accept the fact that one day they are going to, someday some superhero may also come in their life and may also help them get rid of these world wars. So it was particularly during the events like Great Depression and the Second World War that comics, through such superheroes, began reflecting on the ongoing themes. And due to their cheap pricing and portability, they were easily accessible. Consequently, DC Comics was mainly the part of post-colonial India, where westernization had begun to make its impact on India. So we should remember that after the independence, where there was a huge gap when so many liberalization policies were being introduced, when there was a time when an eye towards the West, or kind of Western manners, Western civilization, people looked up to, mimicking and trying to be like their Western counterpart. At the same time, there was also an urge in the Indian middle classes to go and find jobs in the American Silicon cities. So in a way, these comics were trying to import the culture, the civilization of the West, and trying to familiarize Indian audience at a very basic level, not only the audience, the adult, but also the children at a very basic level, what it is, how America looks like, because there were no dish TV connections then, there was no internet then, and it was only through these visuals that came through comic books. People had a glimpse of the other part of the world which was completely inaccessible to them, which was unseen by them, but there was an intense desire to explore that place as well. Now, coming to the Indrajal comics. Indrajal comics was very much a comics which was introduced in India, but in a way it also borrowed certain kind of storylines and the idea of superheroes from the West. Indrajal Comics was produced by the Times Group in India, which introduced 3 other American characters to Indian comic lovers: Phantom, Mandrake and Flash Gordon. A total of 803 Indrajal comics were published, with several other titles including Bahadur, Rip Kirby, Lieutenant Drake, Dara, Garth and so many others. Phantom, known as Vetal in its Hindi translation, was the first Indrajal comics introduced in 1964. So Phantom became the first hero of Indrajal comics, and because he was a phantom, he had an English name. So for Indian audience, in order to strike a relatability, so his name was changed to Vetal. And in so many versions of Phantom, you would see that Phantom is being called as the Vetal when he is translated into the regional languages of India. Image in the first edition of Indrajal comics says, promising to produce the best comics it possibly can. So in a way, because the comics industry was very new in India and people had really nowhere to go, there was no origin, and these were the beginning years, these were the years that were shaping the comics culture in India. So Indrajal presents in the right hand side of your screen, you would see there is a letter to the editor, and I would like to read this editor because it gives you a hint, it gives you an insight into the aim and objective of starting the Indrajal comics. So the Indrajal comics, the editor writes to the readers who would be the prospective readers of the comics. He says, "Dear friend, this comic book marks the beginning of a small effort to reproduce, create, print and make available to you entertaining, healthy and educational color comics in India." And still, parents always are on the lookout what their children are looking for. Even in cell phones, there are so many things that a child, an innocent child may have access to. So what kind of stories are being brought to the children, what kind of stories, what kind of education, what kind of mindset is being garnered in the students, is being garnered in the small children. Parents were always on the lookout, because being from a Western civilization, being from America, which was alien, which was also different, parents had their apprehensions in mind that these comics may in a way impart something which will not be good for the innocence, something vulgar, something cheap, something sexual, so which the parents thought will not be a good idea for their children to become accustomed to, because there was lot of cultural gap between India and American children. So when these comics were being borrowed to India, in a way there was a certain kind of appropriation, there was a certain kind of improvement, there was a certain kind of revision which was also being done when they were translated into their Indian context. So you might have, it further reads, you might have read on a preceding page that, I quote, "all sorts of stories are told about the phantom. Some are imaginary, but many are true." So this is another technique, this is another tactic to pull the audience, making them feel that they are listening the real life adventures of phantom. These stories have happened somewhere in the real life, and which brings the small children all the more closer to them. It makes them all the curious, and it also kinds of makes the image of phantom larger than life, because children then start believing if phantom can do it in real life, so can they. Similarly, all sorts of things are said about the comics, imaginary and true. The truth is that the medium of comics is an excellent one, and there are good comics and bad comics. So, in the very first letter, the editor is clarifying it to the audience that his comics Phantom is going to be a very good comics. It is going to be a kind of pure comics. It is not something which has filthy pages, or which is, so he is kind of striking between moral and immoral stories, and in a way trying to strike a balance that his stories are going to be moralistic stories which teach children ethics. Do you know that in Mexico, over 100 supplementary textbooks in the form of color comics are being taught in the classrooms? So the editor is trying to assert the need of the comics, that comics are not bad, they should not be considered as time pass, they should not be considered as something which is opposite to education. Because what the parents said to their children, that you keep reading comics all day and you don't read your syllabus books, you don't read your course books. So the editor is trying to explain here that comic books can be very good medium in order to impart history, geography and so many other lessons to children which they don't want to read in their course books because of the lack of pictures. Because comic books have pictures, they have visuals, they have striking, attractive pictures to which children want to see. They can be a very good medium for utilizing and for educating small children in schools. With the belief that the medium of color comics could be very useful and effectively employed in a variety of ways in our country and made to serve the cause of eradication of illiteracy and of imparting education through entertainment, the modest venture has been undertaken. So there are two set goals which the Indrajal comics tells to its readers, that firstly, by the usage of pictures we can fight illiteracy, because there are people who don't know how to read, and if we want to communicate something to them, visuals can be the best option. By making them merely see the pictures, we can educate them. And secondly, comics are the medium which offers education through entertainment. Obviously, there are fictional stories, there are superhero stories, there are adventurous stories, horror stories, all sorts of stories which can be utilized that trigger interest in a children's mind rather than boring, mundane, monotonous history books where children are only bombarded with facts, with historical records that they have to mug up. But comics present themselves as an alternative by combining education through entertainment. This modest venture has been undertaken. I am pledged to give you only the really good comics. So the editor says there is nothing profane, there is nothing ugly, there is nothing vulgar or cheap in this comics. This comics is going to be part of good comics. So one of the very basic mindsets when the comics was introduced in India, the comics industry, the producers, the creators had this in mind that their comics will only be bought in India if they are serving moralistic stories, if they are serving ethical stories. So the kind of content that goes into the comics was put under the surveillance, was very much kind of viewed very critically, that if parents found or if adults found something obscene, something ugly, something that is not appropriate for children, their comic books will be banned and they may have to face the losses. So good comics, and the mark of Indrajal comics shall symbolize and guarantee good, healthy and picturesque reading. So there is also a kind of cultural mindset that is being brought to the focus through the introduction of Indrajal comics. So Indrajal comics was done by B. Govind. The illustrations were done by B. Govind, with the back cover featuring a pin-up poster. Govind's painted covers are highly regarded amongst India's Phantom fans. The Indian version of these American comics were appropriated, censored and modified as per the Indian cultural milieu and taste of the audience. Just as I said, these comics were very much put under the radar because they were being borrowed from the West, and because West is an alien culture, West is considered completely different to what East is not. So East and West are put sometimes in complete opposition to each other. So that is why when this borrowing influence was also being viewed very critically in India. For example, the kissing scenes were removed for children. Names of the places were changed from Bengali to Denkali so as to avoid any confusion and debates among Indian audience. So for a child growing up in America, their parents kissing must be a very normal scene. But in India, it may be looked up with a certain raised eyebrow because this is not a part of our culture where we are brought up, we are trained in a completely different mindset. So when these comics were trying to import, or when the stories were being imported to the Indian context, these kind of visuals were being erased, these kind of visuals were being wiped out. And for example, the hero is kissing the heroine, so in a way the visuals which show that the hero has just hugged the heroine. So this is the kind of appropriation that these comics were doing. Now coming to the next comics, Phantom comics. Before its final publication in March, the Times Group decided to advertise its first comics to the audience for its wider outreach and better marketability. Lee Falk, the American scriptwriter, was known to have introduced this new superhero to its readers. A mysterious figure sporting a mask, called the Ghost Who Can Walk, was the very first American superhero introduced to the Indian audience on a large scale. He was dressed in either a blue or purple jumpsuit with a mask on his face and flash eyes visible. You'll see how Phantom was dressed in the upcoming slides. But before we move on to the next slide, we'll have a look at the advertisement that the editor had put out in certain newspapers and magazines in order to advertise his upcoming new hero called Phantom. The Phantom has arrived. You can now provide your children with engrossing Indrajal comics having picturesque stories packed with adventure, drama and humor. The features are so presented as to combine entertainment with instruction. So you see again and again all the comics are emphasizing, the Indrajal comics is emphasizing its education with entertainment, education with entertainment. So the parents are also inclined to buy these comics books. So it is not just because the decision what the child reads is ultimately made by the parents, that what are they going to buy for their children. These are specially designed for Indian children and are available separately in English, Hindi and Marathi. So these were the translated version. And this is how the Phantom looked like. On the right of your screen, you can see that he's all in purple, wearing blue suit and boots, and there is also something blue on the eyes, blue mask. So, and the Hindi version of the Phantom reads Denkali par Akraman. So, Denkali was actually Bengali, but when it was imported in India, it was made Denkali so that any resemblance to reality can be prohibited, so that there are no controversies that arise out of its resemblance to real life or real places that exist in India. So, Bengali is done as Denkali. However, in comparison to his erstwhile superheroes, Batman and Superman, Phantom was not American enough, who lived in the jungles of Bangla, renamed as Denkali in India. There is a sort of ambiguity and oriental element attached to Phantom, unlike other American superheroes. So, unlike Superman and Batman, who are white completely and who are there in the metropolitan cities of America, for example, New York and big cities, being their saviors, acting as their saviors, Phantom was somebody who actually was very much different from these westernized, white, big superheroes. And how was he different? We will see. One of the key reasons for the Phantom's success in India was the effort Indrajal Comics made to adapt his stories for the local audience. Published in multiple languages including Hindi, Bengali, Tamil and Marathi, the Phantom's adventures became accessible to readers across the country. And because you can see the faces of the people all across the visual, that is the cover page of the comics that is there on your screen, you can see that there are people, black people are also there, white people are also there, tribal people, right? Somebody wearing hair mask is also there. So Phantom was somebody, who just did not restrict his antiques or adventures only till America. But his adventures also came to India, his adventures also came to other colonized places, and that is why he is more relatable, and that is why he is more identifiable, and that is why he became a bigger hit, a bigger superhero than Batman and Superman in India. Phantom was much bigger and much renowned than Batman and Superman comics in India. Now, another character is Mandrake the Magician, which is also another comic, Mandrake magazine, which was introduced by Indrajal Comics. Lee Falk created another comic book character, Mandrake, who was a magician. Looked dapper and had a recognizable moustache. Mandrake lived in Xanadu. So, if you see the difference between Phantom and Mandrake, Phantom looks like a superhero. He has a suit, he has a gun, he has people to fight with, but Mandrake, the magician, is very much like a gentleman, a white gentleman who is just dressed in coat and suit, and he does not have any superpowers, but it is just the magic through which he fights all the evils. So, he is a magician who lives in Xanadu, and he wears a hat, and just like so the visuals here are just like he is dressed up just like any other magician. He used powers of hypnotism and illusion to fight crime and acting as a savior in troubled times. So, he used, what were his superpowers? His superpowers were not actually superpowers or supernatural powers, but his superpowers were something which were based in science of hypnotism, science of illusion, that you see something sometime and then you think that you've just seen it and it has disappeared. So, it is only through magic, it is only through the logic of science that he was able to play magic and make people believe that he is also another superhero that has been introduced by Indrajal Comics. Mandrake has also demonstrated other powers including turning invisible, shape-shifting, levitation and teleportation. His hat, cloak and wand passed down from his father Theron, possesses great magical properties which in time Mandrake learns how to use. So you see all the ways in which he fights evil is turning invisible, shape-shifting, levitation and teleportation. These are all related to science. In this way, Mandrake introduced many concepts of physics through comic books, including hypnosis, time travel and scientific laws through what seemed to be magic to children. So children always believed that he is being a magician, but these were the very difficult, complex physics laws that the comic book was introducing through the image of Mandrake and make people believe that he is able to act like just another hero who can save people from the evils and monsters. Flash Gordon is yet another superhero which is introduced by Indrajal comics. Flash Gordon was the superhero of space created by Alex Raymond. So you see three different kinds of superheroes are being created by Indrajal comics. One is very much the Phantom who fights in the forest, who has got actually in reality who has actually got the real powers. Then we have somebody called as Mandrake who does not have any superpower, but it is just the science, because we just had scientific revolution in the 19th century, and it was just the scientific revolution in its full bloom that Mandrake had come to access, that Mandrake had accessibility to scientific laws, and in a way comics was trying to advertise that science is going to be the future of the world and you can do so much if you study science. So and then we have finally the Flash Gordon. The Flash Gordon, this is a story. Flash Gordon is a superhero of space. Somebody like if you would have in India also you had a series on Doordarshan, if you would remember, Captain Vyom, so who was always there in this space. So Flash Gordon in the comic book character can be resembled with somebody like Captain Vyom. This is a story of a futuristic world where a planet Mongo is about to strike Earth, and the hero sets off on his journey to space with his girlfriend and scientist on a rocket to save the latter. No matter how many times the main characters cheat death, a new cliffhanger begs the question of how they will do it again with the latest grotesque monster or technological trap. Some of the objectionable aspects which are comfortably accepted by Flash Gordon. So Flash Gordon is in a way also regarded as one of the racist comics, which has implicit biases against the post-colonized nations or the nations who are not the superpowers as America. So some of the objectionable aspects which are comfortably accepted by Flash Gordon are his belief in colonial empires such as that of the Ming. So Flash Gordon believes there should be empire, there should be somebody who, so the concept of empire itself emerges from the fact that you treat somebody that they cannot govern themselves. So that is why you require a power which is higher than them, which is bigger than them, to control them, to govern them, to civilize them, because then only you can justify your governance over them. So in a way, Flash Gordon comics kind of propagated the idea of empire. The white fascination of Flash also continues. I quote, "Despite neither of them looking all that remarkable, it's a bit remarkable how, with nearly every new alien race they meet, either the king or the queen of that race almost immediately becomes obsessed with marrying Dale or Flash." Dale is the girl who is in Flash Gordon, who Flash is in love with. So anybody whosoever meets Flash is always attracted, is always enchanted, is always fascinated, and they fell in love with Flash. How can that be possible? So this is what is shown in the comics, that they are so good looking, they are so attractive, they are white. So everybody just falls in love with them immediately without even taking note of how their character is or how do they behave in reality. Now coming to the conclusion, DC Comics or Indrajal both promoted the idea of male superheroes, while the women characters were only depicted as the male counterparts' love, interest, or some damsels in distress. Both comics also depicted white superheroes as the savior of the world. On the contrary, the people from the colonized or global south were depicted as the strange, weird creatures in the form of aliens. The Western comics in India were mainly consumed by the upper middle classes, educated and sophisticated people who had certain access and were able to strike a relatability with the Western culture, ideas and landscape. Obviously, who would buy these comics? Only those people who had certain idea about how America looked like. Somebody who doesn't know English, somebody who doesn't know what America is, what is its culture, what is its civilization, they would not be drawn towards to Indrajal comics, but they would rather be drawn towards the Indian counterpart of the comics where they can strike the relatability. So, despite being a popular form or considered as of lowbrow art, the Indian versions of Western comics occupied a comparatively elitist circle. Thank you.